Picture this. It's a Sunday morning in late January 2026. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation's flagship political programme, Insiders, is on air. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is sitting across from his interviewer, and the conversation turns to Canada. And then, almost casually, Albanese drops it. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, will visit Australia and address Parliament in March. The interviewer barely pauses. The conversation moves on. But in diplomatic circles, in foreign ministries, in the corridors of Washington, the people who track these things take notice. Because what just happened on that Sunday morning TV programme is not casual at all. It is, when you understand the full context, one of the most carefully weighted signals Australia has sent to the world in years. And the person it was aimed at isn't Mark Carney, it's Donald Trump. Stay with me here, because to understand why this moment matters, you have to understand the week leading up to it. You have to understand a speech that stopped a room full of the world's most powerful people dead in their tracks. And you have to understand the extraordinarily difficult position Australia finds itself in right now. Caught between the alliance that has guaranteed its security for 75 years and a world that is rapidly, irreversibly changing around it. Let's go back 5 days before Albanese's announcement. It's January 20th, 2026. Davos, Switzerland. The World Economic Forum's annual gathering, that cathedral of global capitalism where heads of state, billionaires and central bankers descend on the Alps to discuss the future of everything. Mark Carney takes the stage. Now, Carney is not a typical politician. He spent years as Governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. He's a man who has spent his career in rooms where the stakes were existential and the language was precise. When he speaks, he is careful, measured, deliberate, every word weighed. What he says in Davos is anything but careful. Carney stands at the lectern and begins, partly in French. Today I will talk about a rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction, and the beginning of a brutal reality where geopolitics among the great powers is not subject to any constraints. He is not speaking to an academic audience. He is not describing a distant hypothesis. He is describing right now. He goes on. For decades, countries like Canada and like Australia prospered under what they called the rules-based international order. They joined its institutions, they praised its principles, they benefited from its predictability. They pursued values-based foreign policies under its protection. And they knew, says Carney, that the story was partially false, that the strongest powers would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, that international law applied with varying rigour depending on the identity of the accused. But now, Carney says, something has fundamentally broken. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. The multilateral institutions that middle powers relied on, the WTO, the UN, the COP climate frameworks, the very architecture of collective problem solving, are under direct threat. And then the line that cuts through the room like a blade. Middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The room gives Carney a standing ovation. For Davos, that is extraordinary. World Economic Forum audiences are not given to spontaneous demonstrations of approval. These are people who have heard everything. Carney's speech hits differently because it names something people have been circling around for months, but nobody in his position has dared say out loud. Carney never mentions Donald Trump by name. He doesn't have to. Every person in that room knows exactly who he is talking about. Trump is also at Davos, and when reporters catch up with him after Carney's speech, he delivers his response in a way that makes the subtext explicit. Staring into the cameras, Trump says, "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." Think about that sentence for a moment. The President of the United States has just told the Prime Minister of Canada, a sovereign nation, a founding NATO ally, one of America's closest partners in intelligence, defence and trade, that Canada exists at American sufferance, that Canada's independence is conditional on American goodwill. And then, in a move that underscores just how personal this has become, Trump withdraws his invitation for Canada to join his so-called Board of Peace, the new international body he is assembling to replace traditional multilateral diplomacy. He posts a letter on Truth Social addressed to Carney that drips with performative condescension, informing him that the board is withdrawing Canada's invitation. Now, here's something critical you need to understand about the Board of Peace, because it is at the absolute centre of everything that follows. Trump has been assembling this body ostensibly to oversee Gaza's reconstruction and broker global peace deals. Its founding members include Hungary's Viktor Orban, Argentina's Javier Milei, several Gulf states, and various governments that share Trump's ideological disposition towards strongman politics. Permanent membership reportedly requires $1 billion in cash contributions. The chair, of course, is Trump, permanently. Not one Western liberal democracy has signed on. Not France, not the UK, not Germany, not Sweden, not Norway, not Canada. Every Western ally with a functioning democratic tradition has looked at this construct, a Trump-chaired alternative to the United Nations with $1 billion buy-in, and quietly, carefully declined. Australia has been invited, and Australia has been conspicuously, deliberately non-committal. When asked, Albanese says the government will respectfully consider the invitation. He says Australia is a founding member of the United Nations. He says these things require considered, orderly deliberation. What he does not say is yes. And now, just 5 days after Carney's earthquake of a speech, 5 days after Trump tells Canada it lives at America's pleasure, 5 days after that extraordinary standoff in the Swiss Alps, Albanese goes on national television and announces that Carney is coming to address the Australian Parliament. This is the moment we are here to understand. Albanese goes further. When his interviewer references Carney's Davos speech, the rupture in the world order, the brutal reality, the middle powers on the menu, Albanese says, simply, I agree with him. 3 words, carrying enormous weight. He doesn't criticise Trump directly. He's careful about that. When pressed on specific Trump comments, he says some things are entirely not appropriate and completely unacceptable, but he doesn't elaborate. The discipline is intentional. Australia has too much at stake to open a direct confrontation with Washington. But the signal is unmistakable. Australia is not just observing Carney's middle power thesis, it is endorsing it. And by inviting Carney to stand in the Australian Parliament and make the case in person, it is lending that thesis the full weight of sovereign institutional legitimacy. To understand why this is so significant, you have to understand what Australia's situation actually looks like right now, because it is genuinely precarious in ways that casual observers miss. On one level, Australia and America have never been closer. In October 2025, Albanese finally secured his long-sought face-to-face meeting with Trump at the White House. The meeting produced 2 headline outcomes: a critical minerals and rare earths framework worth more than $8.5 billion in collaborative investment, and a reaffirmation that AUKUS, the $240 billion submarine deal linking Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, would proceed, in Trump's words, full steam ahead. Those are real, concrete wins. Australia walked away from the White House with something tangible, and the relationship, on the surface, looked strong. But underneath the surface, the fault lines are visible to anyone paying attention. AUKUS is under constant uncertainty. The American submarine industrial base is running 3 years behind schedule. The US Navy is already more than 20 submarines short of its target of 66 nuclear attack submarines. America is supposed to sell Australia its first second-hand submarine in 2032, but the American shipyards are delivering fewer boats to their own navy than planned. Pentagon officials have signalled that Australia needs to dramatically increase its defence spending. Some say to 3.5% of GDP, others say 3%, and Australia is currently sitting at around 2%. That gap is a source of continuous friction. Then there is Trump's tariff regime. He has hit Australian steel and aluminium with 50% tariffs. Australia has tried to negotiate relief. Progress has been slow. The administration's America First doctrine doesn't distinguish much between adversaries and allies when it comes to industrial policy. And then there is the broader question that haunts Australian strategic thinkers in a way it never has before. What does the alliance actually guarantee? The ANZUS Treaty, the security pact that has anchored Australian foreign policy since 1951, was always understood to mean that if Australia faced an existential threat, America would be there. But that understanding rested on assumptions about American reliability, American institutional continuity, American commitment to alliances over transactions. Those assumptions are now openly contested. Carney's speech at Davos didn't just resonate in Ottawa. It landed in Canberra like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every conversation about Australia's strategic future. The Canada-Australia relationship has been deepening quietly for months, in ways the headlines haven't fully captured. In October 2025, the same month Albanese was at the White House, Canada and Australia signed a bilateral agreement on critical minerals and rare earths, focused on building supply chain resilience and reducing dependence on China's dominant processing industry. Both countries are sitting on enormous reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel and rare earth elements that the entire global green energy transition depends on. Both countries have an interest in ensuring those resources aren't leveraged against them. That agreement was the foundation. The parliamentary address is the architecture built on top of it. When Carney stands in the Australian Parliament in March, he will be doing something that carries enormous symbolic weight. Foreign leaders who address the Australian Parliament are a select group. It is one of the most formal expressions of partnership in the Australian diplomatic playbook. A recognition that the visitor represents not just a government, but a set of shared values and shared interests, weighty enough to warrant that extraordinary platform. The leaders of the United States have addressed the Australian Parliament. So has the Queen of England. Xi Jinping addressed it in 2014, back when the relationship with China was still in its collaborative phase. The honour is reserved. It means something. And in this particular moment, with Carney having just delivered the most consequential speech about the collapsing world order that any Western leader has offered in years, inviting him to stand before Australian legislators carries a very specific meaning. It says, "We hear what you are saying. We share the diagnosis. And we want you to say it here, in this building, on this continent, to our people." Now, the question everyone is dancing around without quite saying out loud: is Australia breaking with America? The answer is no, not even close. And this is where the nuance matters enormously. Albanese is not pivoting away from the alliance. AUKUS remains Australia's defining strategic commitment. The critical minerals framework with Washington is real. The Five Eyes intelligence partnership is intact. The American military presence in Australia, the rotating marine deployments in Darwin, the joint facilities at Pine Gap, continues uninterrupted. What Australia is doing is something more subtle and more interesting. It is hedging. It is building a second tier of relationships that don't depend entirely on a single alliance partner. It is taking out insurance in a world where the terms of the American guarantee have become less predictable. It is, in the language Carney used at Davos, developing greater strategic autonomy. This is not disloyalty. This is what every sensible middle power is doing right now. The Europeans are doing it, Japan is doing it, South Korea is doing it. The countries that have been most embedded in the American security architecture are, quietly and carefully building redundancy into their foreign policies in a way they haven't felt the need to do since the Cold War ended. Australia has two characteristics that make it particularly interesting in this emerging dynamic. The first is its geography. Australia sits at the nexus of the Indo-Pacific, the region that everyone agrees will define the 21st century's strategic competition. Its relationships, its basing agreements, its trade flows, and its military posture all matter enormously to the balance of power in that ocean. It is not a small player in the region where the biggest game is being played. The second is its resources. Australia is one of the world's great repositories of the materials that the energy transition and the digital economy run on. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, iron ore, natural gas. In a world where supply chain security has become a primary concern of every major power, Australia's endowment is a form of strategic leverage that the country is only beginning to consciously deploy. Canada, notably, has the same two qualities in different configurations. Enormous resources, strategic geography. A position in the global order that makes it indispensable to anyone who wants to build a coalition capable of navigating what Carney calls the rupture. Here is what makes the timing of Albanese's announcement so revealing. He made it 3 days after Carney's Davos speech. Not 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 days. In diplomatic time, 3 days is essentially simultaneous. The Albanese government had clearly been watching, prepared to respond, and decided that Carney's framing of the world, middle powers, rupture on the menu, was the moment to signal alignment. They also had domestic calculations in play. Australia went to the polls in May 2025 and returned Albanese's Labour government with a strengthened majority. The opposition Liberal National Coalition had been widely identified by voters as mirroring Trump's political posture, cutting public spending, attacking institutions, projecting ideological alignment with the MAGA movement. Voters rejected that. Australia's electorate, by a clear margin, chose a government that was sceptical of what Trumpism represents. Albanese governs with that mandate, and that mandate gives him permission to do something his predecessors might have found more difficult: to acknowledge, however carefully, that the rules-based order on which Australian prosperity and security has rested is under genuine stress, and that Australia must think clearly about what comes next. There is a phrase that has emerged from analysts tracking this period of global realignment, a phrase that captures the dilemma Australia faces with crystalline precision. They call it the sovereignty trap. The idea is this: countries like Australia have deepened their integration with the American security and economic architecture to the point where the cost of any significant departure from it feels prohibitive. AUKUS costs hundreds of billions of dollars and spans decades. The Five Eyes intelligence arrangement is baked into how Australian security agencies operate at a fundamental level. The US dollar underpins global trade in the commodities Australia sells. The trap is that this depth of integration, which was once a source of comfort, has become a source of vulnerability. When the anchor itself becomes unpredictable, being anchored to it creates risk rather than eliminating it. Carney's message is that the way out of the trap is not to cut the anchor loose, that would be disastrous, but to build additional moorings. More relationships, more frameworks, more coalitions. Not to replace the American alliance, but to create the conditions in which Australia is not solely dependent on its continuation. The parliamentary address by Carney is one of those additional moorings. It is Australia saying to the world, we are engaged with like-minded nations. We are thinking about our place in the emerging order. We are not simply waiting to see what Washington decides. So what actually happens when Carney arrives in Canberra in March? What does this mean in practice? It means at minimum that two of the most articulate proponents of the middle power thesis, Albanese and Carney, will be standing together on one of the world's most visible institutional stages, making the case that countries like theirs have agency, have leverage, and have a responsibility to act collectively. It reinforces the critical minerals partnership between their two countries. It opens conversations about trade diversification. Both Canada and Australia are scrambling to deepen relationships with Europe, Japan, South Korea and India in ways that reduce their exposure to American tariff volatility. It also sends a message to every other middle power watching. New Zealand is watching, South Korea is watching, the European Union is watching. Japan, which has its own extraordinarily complex calculation to make about the American alliance, is watching very closely. A visible, institutionalised expression of solidarity between Canada and Australia, two Five Eyes countries, two traditional American allies, two resource-rich democracies, is not just bilateral symbolism. It is a proof of concept. It shows that this kind of coalition building is possible, that it doesn't require abandoning existing commitments, that middle powers can choose the menu, not just sit on it. And what about Trump? What happens when Washington notices? It has almost certainly already noticed. The Trump administration is alert to signals of drift among allies. When countries that are supposed to be in the American orbit start publicly endorsing frameworks that name American behaviour as a source of global instability, that registers. The withdrawal of Canada's Board of Peace invitation was partly a punishment for Carney's Davos speech. The administration understands that words have consequences and that solidarity between allies who are pushing back carries strategic weight. Australia has been careful, deliberately, methodically careful, to avoid the kind of direct provocation that invites retaliation. Albanese doesn't name Trump. He speaks in the language of multilateralism rather than opposition. He continues to work the AUKUS deal, to pursue the critical minerals framework, to maintain the institutional depth of the alliance. He is not the kind of politician who courts confrontation for its own sake, but the signal is real. The Carney invitation is not something that happens by accident in the middle of a global crisis of this magnitude. It is a considered act by a government that has decided the future of Australian security cannot be built on a single foundation, and that the time to start constructing additional pillars is now, while there is still time to build carefully rather than scrambling in panic. Here is what I want you to take away from all of this. We are living through the end of something. Not the end of America, not the end of Western alliances, not the end of the liberal democratic tradition, but the end of the particular configuration of global power that emerged from the Second World War and stabilised after the Cold War. The institutions, the assumptions, the frameworks, the language of international relations that have governed global affairs for 75 years are being contested in ways they have not been since they were built. Carney called it a rupture, not a transition. The distinction matters. A transition implies that you pass through uncertainty and emerge on the other side into a new order that broadly resembles the old one. A rupture means the old order is broken. What comes next has to be built from scratch, by people who are paying attention and doing the work. Australia inviting Mark Carney to stand in its parliament is a small piece of that building work. It is not a dramatic break. It is not a confrontation. It is, if you know how to read the language of diplomacy, a deliberate, carefully executed step by a government that has decided it will not simply wait to see what the great powers decide about the world. If you want to understand the global realignment that is happening right now, not the headlines, but the underlying tectonic shifts, this story is one of the clearest windows into it you will find. A Sunday morning TV announcement, a Canadian Prime Minister coming to Canberra, a world changing quietly, in real time, in the language of parliamentary invitations and diplomatic signals. Watch what Carney says when he gets there. Watch how the region responds. And watch how Washington reacts, because that reaction will tell you a great deal about how much room middle powers actually have to manoeuvre in the world that is coming. If this breakdown helped you see past the surface of a story that most people are barely covering, consider subscribing and leave a comment below. I want to know, do you think Australia is handling this the right way? Is quiet alignment with Canada enough, or is the moment calling for something bolder?